Hey everybody, I've got another edition of our 10 and 10 series I want to do with you today about the period in King David's life where he was living in the town of Ziklag. Now, this is covered in the book of First Samuel in chapters 27 through 31, so obviously I'm not going to take time to read all that scripture to you today, but I encourage you to go back and look at that, see everything that was going on in David's life, and I want to take 10 minutes and give you 10 takeaways from that story. Over in chapter 22, David is hiding out from King Saul over in the land of Moab. And you'll remember that's where his great grandmother Ruth was from. So it was natural that he'd go and maybe had some family still there, some contacts, but he's hiding over there in Moab. And David says he wants to stay in Moab until, as he says, till I know what God will do for me. So David gets a visit from a prophet named Gad, who tells him that he needs to return to the kingdom of Judah and get ready to be king. Now, let's remember a few things, and this is really takeaway number one. So I want to go ahead and start my timer here. And so timer's going. Takeaway number one from this story of David's episode in Ziklag is that David was called and appointed to be king, but the plan this far had not been unfolding the way he thought it was. He had to trust when he didn't know what God was going to do. Now, the prophet Gad told David that he needed to go back to Judah, and this was without a doubt not what David wanted to hear. But he needed to learn to trust God even when he didn't understand what was going on. So that's takeaway number one. So here's takeaway number two. In chapters 23 through 26 of First Samuel, here's what's going on. Saul is killing David's allies. People are going to Saul and ratting David out and telling Saul where David's hiding out and trying to get him killed. David's has spared Saul's life twice in those chapters. Twice he had Saul where he could kill him, and twice he spared Saul's life. But Saul, would not quit trying to kill David. And David's mentor Samuel dies during this time too. And so David is frustrated. He's alone. Saul's killing his allies. People are ratting him out. And he lets discouragement, despair, and fear enter his life. And so we get to chapter 27 of First Samuel. And here's what David said. David said in his heart, now I shall perish by Saul's hand. There's nothing better for me to do than to escape to the land of the Philistines. So a long, sad story begins right here in David's life. In his depression, his despair, his fear, he forgot God's instruction from the prophet Gad that he needed to stay in the land of Judah, and he forgot his anointing by the prophet Samuel and his promise from God that he was going to be king of Judah. So there was no way that Saul was going to be able to kill him. God's purpose for his life was to be king. So there's takeaway number two. Despair and fear overruled God's promises and God's provision in his life. So takeaway number three is this. In the land of the enemy, over there in Philistia, David's spiritual life took a tumble. During this period in David's life, while he was living in the land of the Philistines and living in the city of Ziklag, there are no records of David writing any of the Psalms. There's no record of poetry or anything like that coming from David during this time in life. His spiritual life was being taken away from him, and he was thinking he was following his own heart instead of God's direction. I think we all need to ask ourselves, have we ever been there? Do you ever just look around while you're in a spiritually dry place and you think, what happened? How did I get here? It happened for David when he quit asking God what he needed to do and he followed his own heart. So that's takeaway number three, is that in spiritually dry places, we forget where we are and we lose our ability and our drive to do anything for God. So here's takeaway number four. Over in 1 Samuel 27:5, listen to this. David goes to King Achish, who is the king of the city of Gath. And David says this to him. He says, if I have now found favor in your eyes, give me a place in some town that I may dwell there. Now think about who David's talking to. He's talking to the Philistine king of Gath. Does that name ring a bell at all? Gath? Remember Goliath of Gath? Remember earlier in David's life when he had confronted the Philistines and he had killed the giant? And now here he is, despair and fear and doubt have entered his life. Imagine David on the day that he killed Goliath of Gath, full of the Spirit, slaying the giant. being braver than any man on the field. And now here he is in a spiritually dry place because he's following his own heart, begging the king of Gath to give him a place to live. Fear and despair are indeed powerful enemies. That's takeaway number 4. Here's takeaway number 5. The man after God's own heart becomes a bandit during this time. So David is in the land of the Philistines, and King Achish lets him live in the town of Gath. And David basically becomes a bandit during this time. He killed all the people of towns that he attacked, and he took their possessions. And the word tells us that David didn't leave anybody alive because he didn't want anybody going back to King Achish and telling him what he was doing. So David would go in there and he would wipe everybody out and steal it. He became nothing more than a bandit. Um, while these people that he was attacking were basically Israel's enemies, this was had put him on a dark path in his life. He was fighting battles for profit now rather than for God's honor. So, takeaway number 5 is David is on a dark path now, and he's killing for profit rather than God's honor. So, here's takeaway number 6. We're up in chapter 28 now. David has now completely sold out to the ungodly Philistines, and he's offering to fight for them. The Philistines are getting ready to go to war with Israel, and David is so sold out, has so forgotten who he is that he is offering to fight for King Achish, a Philistine king, against Israel. You know, to some degree, I think every Christian, every believer has kind of been where David is, where you have forgotten who you are. You become somebody you never thought you'd be. How could David, the man who'd been so mighty in war, the man who had been his hero of Israel, the man who had killed Goliath, be at this point now where he's getting ready to help Israel's enemies fight against Israel? God's allowing David to learn a hard lesson. So that's takeaway number 6 for us today. Here's takeaway number 7. By the time you get to chapter 29, Philistine army is getting ready to go fight, and they line up and they're going to pass in front of the other generals. And all of a sudden, the other Philistine generals, they notice David and his mighty men are there, and they say, "What are these Hebrews doing there?" And they're not happy at all about David being there. And King Achish tries to smooth it over a little bit and says, "Oh, I trust David." But the lords of the Philistines, the generals and the other kings, they're having none of it. They know who David really is. They know what he's capable of, and they want no part of him in their army. So David gets rejected by his frenemies at this point. Others sometimes can see what we're blind to. Others can sometimes see what we have become blind to. David's enemies knew who he really was. And no matter what dark path he was on personally, they knew who he really was. They had seen the Spirit of God working in his life and knew what he was capable of and knew that he was not one of them. David had forgotten who he really was, but his enemies reminded him of who he really was. And it's really when the world has a better sense of how Christians should behave and what should be acceptable to Christians than Christians do. What a tragedy is that. But David had forgotten who he was, who he belonged to, what his purpose in life was. So that's takeaway number 7 for us today. Here's takeaway number 8. David began to reap what he had sown. Now remember, during this time, he's living in Ziklag. He become a bandit. He's going out and raiding other towns. He's taking their property and killing everybody and just becoming a bandit, a regular bad guy. David gets rejected by the Philistine lords. And so David and his men, they just go back to Ziklag. There's nothing else for them to do. And guess what? When they get there, they find out that the Amalekites had attacked Ziklag. They'd taken David's family, the families of all his men, all their property, all of it was gone. So think about that. David has gone from being getting ready to be the next king of Israel. And now he has no country because he's rejected Israel and the Philistines have rejected him. He has no family and property because they've been carried off. And when they get back to Ziklag and his men see what's happened, they even discuss for a while stoning David and killing him for leading them into that hard place. But you get to chapter 30 there in 1 Samuel, and it says this. This is the turning point in David's life in this period of time where he's living in Ziklag. Chapter 30, verse 6 says this: David strengthened himself in the Lord. All those times where the word says that David inquired of the Lord. This one episode, it says David followed his own heart, and look where it led him to. And now David begins to turn back to the Lord. And after chasing the Amalekites down, after he's been strengthened in the Lord, he chases the Amalekites down. They get all their families back. They get all their properties back. And as a matter of fact, David gets more than he had to start with. But he had to turn back to the Lord to get it. So there's takeaway number 8. Here's takeaway number 9. God's timing was perfect in this situation because the battle that David was about to help the Philistines fight against Israel turned out to be the very battle where Saul and Jonathan get killed. The very battle where Saul meets his end. After twice sparing Saul's life and honoring God by not lifting up his hand against Saul, David, God worked in David's life and spared him from taking part in the battle where Saul would be killed. So God's timing was perfect in this situation, and that's takeaway number 9. Here's takeaway number 10. David's remorse at the news of Saul's death showed that he had come back to himself, and he was ready now to become king over Israel. The years in the wilderness had been used by God to train and equip David for his future role. That's takeaway number 10. Now think about that for a minute. All these hard times that we go through in life, they do train and equip us. And we follow our own heart sometime, and we walk away from God, and we go and live in Ziklag for a while, and we become people that we never thought we'd be, people that we never imagined that we could be. We even forget maybe who we once were. But God brings us back to ourselves, and he redeems that, and he uses that time to prepare us. So there's 10 takeaways from that period of David's life when he was living in Ziklag. So let's check our timer. And so I went a little over today. That's 10 minutes and 48 seconds. But we covered 4 chapters out of the book of 1 Samuel there, greatly summarized. But I want you to think about that. David, I believe 9 times in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel, it says over and over and over again that David inquired of the Lord about what he should do. And this time, because David let fear and despair and doubt creep into his life, because he was tired. I mean, Saul had been putting the pressure on him. A lot of things were coming against him. But despair and doubt crept into his life, and he went and lived in the land of the Philistines, the enemies of Israel. And he lived with them for a while, became somebody he never thought he would be until God brought him back to his senses with the help of his enemies. So there's your 10 for 10 today. One Bible story covered in a little over 10 minutes today, but 10 things for you to think about there. So I hope that's a blessing for you. Today's April 28th. We're coming up on the end of April. Looking forward to perhaps in a few weeks being able to worship together again in church together and see each other face to face. And looking forward to the day when we can all be together again. And we'll see you soon. Bye.